So, hi everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Louise Lavictoire and I'm the Interim Head of Science at the FBA. So this is the latest instalment of the FBA seminar series where we're looking at the careers to date of the FBA fellows and also talking to you about some of the key projects that the FBA has. We hope you're enjoying the series so far, and if you haven't managed to get to all of the talks and you'd like to catch up, all of them are available to view now under the Discover and Learn tab on the FBA website. If you're not an FBA member, you can also join us under the Join Us tab at fba.org.uk. And some of the benefits of FBA membership are that you can get priority notification about these FBA seminars and any future series that we have, so you can beat the rush and register for our live events sooner than anybody else. So for today's talk, I'd like to welcome Dr. Judy England, who is Senior Specialist in Research with the Environment. Judy's always had a fascination with rivers and wetlands, particularly chalk streams. One of her main interests is the habitat interventions, which led her to focus on monitoring and appraisal of river restoration activities. Judy is going to walk us through the way that river restoration activity has developed over the years, how her work has changed, and summarise some exciting new developments in river restoration.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. As Louise just said, I'm a research scientist with the Environment Agency. I'm also an honorary FBA fellow and honorary senior research fellow at Queen Mary University of London. So today, as with the other fellows' presentations, I'll give an overview of my career and why I became interested in rivers and river restoration. A quick gallop through how river restoration's changed since I've been interested in the subject, and then dwell mostly on my particular area of interest, which is restoration appraisal. So back to the beginning. I grew up in the site of the Berkshire Downs, this is the White Horse at Uffington, which was just down the road, which instilled a love of chalk, downlands, and the streams and rivers that flow from them. Not going to dwell too much on chalk streams per se today, so a quick shout out to Rachel Stubbington's talk. Hers is on the website and gives a lovely description and details of the work we've been undertaking on these temporary rivers. So my playground was the Letcombe Brook. It's a babbling chalk stream in its upper reaches, but further down, it's more of an active channel with eroding cliffs and pools. My appreciation of channel morphology was instilled at this early age, as I invariably ended up with wet feet as I waded into the pools, much deeper than my little waders, a theme that seems to have recurred throughout my career. I went to school in Wantage and onto the sixth form there, where I studied particular interest in biology, closely followed by geography. After my sixth form, I spent a summer with the Agricultural Research Council as a field surveyor and found a wonder that people would actually pay you to go outside and work for a living doing something interesting. This combined with David Attenborough's Life on Earth, which was totally and utterly captivating, led me off to university to combine biology and geography to study environmental sciences. I went off to the bright lights of Norwich, University of East Anglia, where I had the privilege of studying under Brian Moss and Colin Townsend, two of the sort of iconic aquatic ecologists of the age, who just led this focus in my sort of research and area of interest down to aquatic ecology. Though I like terrestrial stuff, aquatic ecology is my passion. I work on fresh waters and then I study and play in marine for my hobbies. At the time, there was also an introduction to restoration, learning all about the work that was going on in the Norfolk Broads and how to try to reverse some of the environmental degradation that had gone on, trying to revert them back to the stable state of how they used to be in the past. My undergrad project was epiphytic diatoms on different plant species in the Norfolk Broad dikes, where I got to work very closely with Brian and gained great appreciation of his love of the subject, but also his wacky sense of humour. So loving the area further, I stayed on for another year in Norfolk and spent a year with the British Trust for Conservation Volunteers, now the Conservation Volunteers. Spent many a day out in the middle of the Broadlands in remote areas that are only accessible by boats, looking at scrubland management and surveys. But realising I had to go and do something else for a living, I wandered off to Cardiff, the other side of the country, and undertook an MSc in applied hydrobiology. I'm the tall one at the front, in case you hadn't worked that out. While I was there, there was this fabled rumours of this great ecologist called Steve Omerod, but I didn't get to meet him at the time, though I did later, because he was off on a sabbatical that year. For my MSc thesis project, I studied the importance of alder fly predation on chironomids. This was spent the summer at Linford Lakes in near Milton Keynes with the Game Conservancy research team led by Nick Giles. The Linford Lakes were a gravel pit in the process of being restored to a nature reserve. They were very much looking at promoting bird life on the reserve, and were looking at sort of the feeding rates of different birds on chironomids. But another important loop in the feeding web and ecosystem they were modelling was Scialis luteria and their predation. So my study focused on their role within the ecosystem, their feeding rates, the size preferences, etc. After my master's, I joined the newly created National Rivers Authority in Thames Region as a biologist. My first role was primarily conducting kick samples, macrovertebrate identification. I developed a love of caddis and sort of general life in chalk streams. My sister was the one who coined the term professional paddler when trying to describe my job to her friends to say what I did. Over the years, my remit changed to also cover plants, fish, diatoms, and water quality. After becoming a team leader, my job title changed periodically as the remit was changed through various restructuring, overseeing fisheries, waste data, and water quality at various times. My career progressed further when I became a research scientist specialising in hydroecology and hydromorphology, a role that I'm still in today. In my early years as a biologist, I spent days out and about in rivers and became fascinated with the distribution of different species in the various habitats in the river. Why particular caddis were found on the sides of stones, but only at the sides of the channel, not in the centre of the channel. Which species can be found in the overhanging vegetation of a concrete channel, suggesting a limitation of habitat rather than water quality. I became interested in whether it was possible to restore the habitats and then look at what species came back as the habitats changed. In the early days of river restoration, it was also termed rehabilitation or enhancement, depending on the sort of nuances of what was trying to be achieved. We started small with flow deflectors. Here we've got some hazel hurdles in the chalk stream, creating areas of erosion and deposition that the deposition then becomes colonized by the plants and sort of reinvigorating the processes with a sort of over wide channel. However, not all our restorations were quite as effective as you can see from these rather horrible looking flow deflectors in a rather very modified channel. In other places, we'd actually build structures, like this is a sort of flow deflectors holding back an area of gravel to try and create specific habitats. In some cases, we'd actually sort of take lessons learned from American in techniques that they'd applied over there and bring them here. And we ended up even in some of the chalk streams instilling large limestone boulders within a river channel to create patterns of flow and substrate diversity for fish. And whilst it had achieved the objective of creating that diversity of habitat, they weren't necessarily appropriate for the rivers that we were looking at. So over time, things got better. We learned to be much more sympathetic and work with nature, and our schemes got more ambitious. Just gives you an idea of some of the sort of more natural mimicking, tree fall, restoring more berms using biodegradable edging that would then sort of naturalize over time. And at the bottom, you see the Brent at Tockington Park, where we broke out concrete channel and reinstated a more natural channel dimensions and sinuosity. There's a wealth of information and schemes on the River Restoration's website, and if you'd like to learn some more about the history and how things have changed, that would be a good place to look. A key change in how people regarded restoration was an alternative way of thinking. Rather than restoring to a fixed state that might not be attainable, was to start thinking about reinstating natural process. This approach necessitates consideration of the restoration scheme in its catchment context and the processes that operate at that scale. It was also the time when rehabilitation and enhancement became incorporated, a more generic term referring to restoring processes rather than restoring to an end state. However, there's still place for more interventionist measures where needed, particularly sort of where we're working in highly modified urban channels, where we're not necessarily sort of restoring processes, and it is a bit more of a sort of gardening exercise. But there are benefits to both people and wildlife of such activities. More recently, there's been a growth in aspiration for river restoration, promoting full river floodplain connectivity. Although not a new concept, the Stage Zero concept provides a more formal framework promoting whole-scale restoration. It is complemented by recognition of the influence of the biota on river forms and processes. The intense development within the UK's floodplains limits where full connectivity can be readily applied, but there's some really exciting projects underway. This gives you a sort of link and sort of ideas to some of these areas and initiatives. Bottom left are links to RRC workshops and presentations, and again at the bottom, really good sources of information if you'd like to learn more about this. There are sort of few key terms that are sort of bandied around that are worth following up if you're interested in the area sort of listed here. So, moving back in time again, thinking back to sort of the early days of restoration. My particular area is in restoration and monitoring appraisal. Many of the schemes were undertaken and still are on the assumption the restoration is a good thing, and if you restore the physical habitat, ecological recovery will take place. In 1997, Margaret Palmer and colleagues produced their famous paper on ecological theory and community restoration ecology, where they developed the field of dreams hypothesis with the conceptualization of this assumption. But the key thing is, if you build it, will they come? But do they? And if they don't, why not? So this inspired me to start a part-time PhD to explore these interesting conundrums. This was coupled with this desire to promote appropriate restoration measures. My studies were undertaken at the University of Hertfordshire under Dr. Ronnie Edmonds-Brown. My field studies were on the rivers Rib and Mimram in Hertfordshire. These photos show you the river restoration scheme investigated on the River Rib, where a weir was removed, channel added, and channel narrowed to reinvigorate remedy historic dredging. Extensive bank works were not allowed in this scheme due to the archaeological restrictions at the site, because it was the site of one of the few Roman mints in the country. And at that time, I also found a solution to my waders overtopping in deep water. Shortly after starting my PhD, I was awarded a Winston Churchill Memorial Travelling Fellowship. This is a wonderful organisation that gives people opportunities to travel, to learn from others, and come back and transfer their knowledge and apply it in the real world. The first stop on my travels was to see the Kissimmee restoration scheme. At the time, this was one of the few whole-scale restoration projects. Not only was the scheme itself amazing in terms of its aspirations and scale, but the scale of the monitoring and appraisal was also extremely impressive. Discussions of the monitoring by the team involved gave one of my favourite quotes at the top of this slide here. Monitoring included 61 expectations. Each of these expectations involved not only consideration of the end point, but the processes on which they depend and the timescales needed for them to act. There are now a series of papers detailing the results of the assessments, which are incredibly useful and interesting read. From Florida, I headed up to Vancouver, where my host was Dr. John Richardson, who told me about the research of his group. Particular interest was his work on riparian zones with experimental studies, including the influence of different depth of buffer zones retained within forestry areas and how that affected the river systems. He also had one of his students investigating the role of aerial insect deposition on the diet of fish, hence the polytunnel over the river in the photo here. Dr. Richardson also introduced me to a series of contacts who explained about the restoration work in the area. This photo shows how trees have been felled and secured to mimic natural tree fall to stabilise the channel. Here we can see car-sized boulders and trees that have been secured as a jam to catch trees being washed downstream. It was only when I went there that I gained a full appreciation of how the changing catchment characteristics can affect river processes. Someone used to babbling around in chalk streams, the rivers I looked to my eyes initially dynamic and exciting, with lots of varied substrate and flow dynamics. But comparing the rivers before and after logging demonstrates how the change in runoff from the catchment affects the river. It was really brought home to me when I was able to see a section of the Chilliwack River, shown here. This river drains an inaccessible and therefore unlogged catchment in the US, which then drains into Canada. It contrasted greatly with the other rivers I'd seen in terms of substrate, hydraulics, and habitat composition. I then ventured to the other side of Canada, to Newfoundland, where I worked with Dr. Don Downer at the newly created Aquatic Centre for Research and Education. Working with his 6 students, we explored the distribution of different aquatic invertebrates in a variety of habitats in one of their more natural streams. It gave me a chance to look in close detail at all the different bugs and beasties that live over there. So back to the UK, and some years later, I would just at this point say that if you're doing a part-time PhD, make sure it's something you're really interested in, because it's a long slog doing it in your spare time. But there are some advantages of doing part-time PhDs. Most primarily is the monitoring timescales that you can get in there. You don't have to complete your field studies in year 1 or 2, but you do have a much longer timescale, which was extremely useful in this case. This shows the results for the rib that I showed you earlier. Among other elements, I studied community change over time, finding that the communities in the restored section became more similar to those of the upstream control section. However, the control section community did change over time, reflecting upstream and catchment processes operating and highlighting the importance and control sites in study design. I also explored the colonisation of different species, some of which took a long time to arrive at the lower sites, even when they only had a few hundred metres to wander downstream. In my other case study, I was able to undertake a field experiment. This is on the Mimram. The site is a chalk stream which has been dredged and deepened in the past. The restoration activity was to introduce gravel to raise the longitudinal profile. Chalk streams are geomorphologically inactive, so they are slow to move sediment within the river channel. Previously, such schemes that we'd undertaken had used the cheapest available gravel. There was even one scheme, not on a chalk stream, but in London, where cobbleside flint rejects had been used because they were the cheapest ones that we could get for the scheme. I wanted to know the effect of this sort of fixed substrate use on the colonisation of invertebrate communities. So within this scheme, one section of the restoration scheme was used a standard gravel size, similar to what we'd normally use within a chalk stream restoration. And the second was a special mix, which was comparable to samples taken of the control riffle. Following restoration activity, the special mix was fairly obviously the most similar to the control site. That's post survey 1. But by the time 2 years had gone by, there was actually an overlap between the samples from the control site and the special gravel, as the sort of finer silts and sands had arrived and making the composition the same, but even after 2 years, the standard gravel section remained different. So suggesting it was worth the extra expense of trying to match the gravel size and be a bit more have a sort of mixed composition within the restoration scheme. The different invertebrate taxa were associated with the different gravel compositions and different gravel treatments, with particular preferences for particular occurrences at different substrate size, but also taking a while to recolonize and have of both the site 1 and site 2 different treatments. As a result of this work, we did change the approach to the substrate we used in future restoration schemes of chalk streams. More recently, I revisited the data in collaboration with Martin Wilkes, exploring the compositional and functional metrics relating to the observed changes to an updated version of Bradshaw's model on ecological restoration. We found the rehabilitation of macroinvertebrate structural complexity was limited within both schemes. Restoration of functional integrity was more difficult to achieve, and that we've also found that functional traits are very useful in evaluating river restoration projects, which provokes lots of discussions about what we're trying to achieve by restoration activities and how do we know whether we've succeeded or not. This brings me nicely to the final element of my studies, which consider the process of restoration appraisal and targeting resources for effective monitoring. As a scientist, you always want to be sure that the monitoring that we undertake is on a sound scientific basis. But as an environment agency, then manager, we only have limited resources to target of the work we want to do. So many restoration schemes are being undertaken, and if you can't monitor them all, how do you decide which ones you're going to do? So it was not only me that was interested in this. In 2002, the River Restoration Centre organised a workshop led by Lydia Burgess-Campbell and Kevin Skinner about the need to appraise restoration activity, and I presented some of my thoughts on the ecological aspects of this. So working with Kevin and then Matt Carter, we developed a prioritisation matrix to target monitoring and appraisal to high-risk, larger and more novel schemes, so where there's the most opportunity to learn. The theory behind this is once a technique on a particular river type has been appraised, it can be applied with more confidence, and you know more about what you're likely to achieve through the restoration activity. And thus, it will be less of a priority for future monitoring. This does not mean that it's not only those schemes that are monitored. Overlaying potential sampling methods highlights the different monitoring that could be applied with some of the quicker and easier approaches for smaller, well-established techniques. But we would definitely advocate wherever you're doing restoration activity, you undertake before and after restoration pictures. Following development of the concept with the restoration, we held another workshop to present the ideas to practitioners and academics, listing their help in recommending survey approaches. A framework for the concept was developed, including best practice concepts such as understanding the catchment context of a proposed scheme, having smart objectives for both the scheme and specific monitoring objectives. These were all collated within the RRC's Pragmo guidance, linked there at the bottom of the slide if you want it. The reform was an EU-funded project which ran from 2012 to 2016, with the aim of providing a framework for the successful hydromorphological restoration measures to reach in a cost-effective targeted ecological status and potential of rivers. I had the pleasure of joining the collaboration in 2013. The project provided a wonderful opportunity to contribute to this European-wide initiative and meet and collaborate with international experts. There is a wealth of evidence and information that was being collated into the Reform Wiki to help managers, practitioners and academics following best practice. As you can see from the flow diagram, the first one is understanding the river characterisation and those catchment processes, what's likely to limit restoration. Then you go through a sort of condition assessment, working out what's wrong, look at potential remedy measures, and then implement them within a cyclical process, and then start again if you're not getting to where you want to be. Some of the key results from the reform project are listed here. I've just pulled out particular ones that are of interest and align with what I'm talking about today. There's further information is available still on the reform website. A particular note here is highlighting the vegetation and plants and how they play a significant role as ecosystem engineers, which aligns with what we previously looked at in terms of process-based restoration and the stage 0 restoration. Also that the biological sampling methods, some of the sort of traditional approaches don't work as capture the right information, but also that restoration has positive effects even in smaller restoration schemes. Again, there's many publications from this research collaboration, but one of particular note in context of this talk was led by Natalie Angelopoulos, which aligns with many of the messages within Pragmo about context, aims, and objectives of monitoring. In 2019, we revisited Pragmo guidance to see if there was still a need and how it could be brought up to date. An online poll indicated that the guidance was still needed, what sections should be retained and which were no longer needed. Mark Nora from the RRC conceptualised how the guidance could be updated and linked with other guidance they held into a wider knowledge base. A wiki version of Pragmo is currently being developed where we can all sort of contribute our ideas and thoughts to it, and each page will be owned and under the remit of particular experts who can then review the context so that we can easily update with the most current information and knowledge and pass that on. Another exciting collaboration I've had the pleasure of being involved with is the River Restoration and Biodiversity Programme led by Scottish Natural Heritage, now Nature Scot, originally led by Phil Boone, who I noticed in the audience today, another research fellow, and is now led by Angus Tree. The programme brings together organisations from the UK and public Ireland under the auspices of the International Union of Conservation for Nature National Committee for UK. Under the project, we've had 2 phases so far where we've reviewed the status of river restoration, considered the effectiveness of particular techniques and outcomes, but having a particular focus on nature-based solutions and promoting biodiversity. The programme highlighted 6 principles for river restoration, shown in these blobs here, and 20 recommendations, of which I've highlighted 2 of them here. One which is sort of investing in long-term monitoring to improve confidence in the evidence base, which aligns nicely with our sort of conceptual diagram we had earlier of investing effort in the big and novel schemes that we're interested in, and also to enlist the help for citizen scientists. We produced a summary of the project within the FBA newsletter if anybody wants to read more about it. So turning to the second of the sort of recommendations, I've also had the pleasure of working with Angela Gunnell and Lucy Shuker to develop the Modular River Survey. This is a habitat survey developed for citizen scientists to enable them to undertake surveys at a scale comparable with biological surveys. You may have heard mention of it briefly within a previous FBA presentation about the Riverfly Partnership. Although the tool was originally devised for to complement riverfly surveys, it can be applied flexibly by river scientists of different spatial scales to complement biological surveys of species with different mobilities and habitat uses. But it can also be used to investigate river responses to different hydrological events and human interventions, including river restoration. The survey sort of puts basically a quadrat over the river, assessing bank tops, bank face, and in channel. And the results return a series of indices that characterize habitat conditions and indications of geomorphic change. And that picture there will give you sort of a map of all the surveys that have been undertaken to date. Morph also allows citizen science to capture different geomorphological information to assess the degree to which a river of a particular type displays the relevant geomorphic features, and to also collaborate with researchers inferring some aspects of river morphodynamics. So far, we have over 350 active citizen surveyors and more than 2.5 modules within the survey. If I just whiz up, sorry, forgot to mention this. The Modular River Survey, as I said, it's sort of the small quadrats or modules, which are called the morph units, and you can undertake one of them, which is sort of a similar sort of scale to which you'd undertake an invertebrate kick sample. If you string 3 of them together, 3 morph units, you would sort of mimic a fish survey size or a plant survey size. But if you string 10 morphs together, you get a multi-morph, which will help you understand and pick up some of the sort of river processes rather than just a snapshot of the river habitats. So as with any survey technique, it's important that you sort of have a sort of structured design when you're applying morph to river restoration schemes. So that's sort of the backy approach, before, after, control, and impact. But we have found some sort of interesting results. Both these papers sort of give you an idea of the sort of the background and the application. First one led by Lucy was the prototype when we sort of first trialled it within the chalk streams of Hertfordshire, thinking that if we can assess and detect differences in habitat characteristics and processes within our chalk streams, then we should be able to do it in most other river systems. And then the second paper sort of gives a much sort of wider application of the survey and the initial results. So we've tried using morph to assess river restoration and found that even within a short time following restoration, there are indicators of a change within the survey. This is the River Bulbourne in, River Bulbourne in Hemel Hempstead, sort of just down the road from me, where again it was it's quite a restricted channel. It's got a flow constraint at the top. It is supposed to be a chalk stream, but it was very overwide and over deepened. So channel narrowing, creating the berms, adding wood in there, and creating sort of patterns in channel habitat diversity. So using morph, we revealed that restoration activity changed the channel dimensions, encouraging the growth of vegetation on the berms and shallower bank faces. This change within the riparian zone was accompanied by an increase of the in-channel plant cover and a slight change in the substrate to coarser sediments. Ellie Beach undertook a small scale study comparing morph with the River Monitoring Initiative, the River Fly Partnership study, and found some sort of very sort of tentative but initial comparisons between the habitat characteristics that we're picking up with morph with the river fly results. A couple of her graphs there, suggesting that this is something we'd like to investigate much further and sort of see how useful these two citizen science tools are together in describing and characterizing our rivers. So thinking about the other recommendation from the IUCN River Restoration and Biodiversity Project was the need for longer term, more detailed and scientific approach to monitoring. Fortunately, we're starting to see the fruition of some sort of long-term investment in monitoring programs that we set up a few years ago. For examples, this is the results of a study comparing changes in the benthos and the hyperea to restoration following the removal of an impoundment on a chalk stream. So a big thanks to Dan and Anne for their help in pulling this paper together, being one the expert on analysis and another the expert on the hypereal zone. So what we found from our study was that hypereus and the benthos responded differently to the restorations undertaken in the study, emphasising that the results from monitoring of the benthic communities cannot be relied upon to inform the understanding of the impact of the restoration on hypereal communities. And thus, given the importance of the hypereal zone in the provision of the ecosystem services they provide, and the role is in terms of the sort of refuge within river systems, I again refer you back to Rachel's presentation for more information about that. We recommend that hypereal zone should be included in future monitoring protocols that aim to assess river restoration success. So finally, just thinking about the future and some of the really interesting things that are going on at the moment. Citizen science is really interesting. We've had lots of positive feedbacks about the surveys. We'd like to test and develop it further. And anybody wishing to get involved, please do so. We're working on improved best practice guidance. This is another of the IUCN project aspirations. We've had expert workshops of like how much baseline survey do you need? How can you balance sort of spatial with temporal resolution in your data? What's the best way that we can sort of recommend some of the sort of bespoke monitoring that we need of some of the more detailed schemes? Money is obviously one of the constraints that we have on monitoring. So it's sort of how do we get the most bang for our bucks, as they say. Thinking about ecological resistance and resilience rather than just sort of community composition. How can we make best use of that? We know some of the trait-based approaches are useful, but what can they tell us? And then there's really exciting development, sort of thinking more about ecosystem level as assessment. What can we tell from eDNA, from the bacteria, the sort of diatom communities, what can they add to the mix? And obviously the social and economic benefits, especially sort of through COVID and lockdown. People are much more appreciative of going out in the environment. If we're doing restoration in activities in sort of urban areas, then they're going to be limited, but the social benefits are much, much wider. Which links nicely with multiple pressures. Morphological degradation or catchment changes are just some of the pressures, but there are other things operating within our river systems. So how do they influence what we anticipate the benefits of a particular restoration activity to be? And then how do we link all this with adapting to climate change and addressing the biodiversity crisis? Where should we be targeting our actions and what should we be doing? So these are just some of the things sort of thinking about and working on in the future. So I'd just like to end with a thank you to all the wonderful inspirational people I've met over the years who've generously shared their knowledge. I've named a few today, but there are so many more. The quality and quantity of the work I've undertaken and presented here is all in part due to successful collaborations and wonderful people that I work with, and long may they continue. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Judy. If anybody's got any questions for Judy, please put them in the chat and I'll invite you to ask them. We do have some questions already. So Ed, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Judy your question?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I was just wondering, with regards to just like the sort of form and structure of riverbed composition, does that significantly change over the years following a project? And I'm guessing obviously it's going to change with regards to the rivers, like hydrological nature as well. But in terms of how many years following restoration do you see like a general stability within the structure of a river reach following restoration? Is that something that has been previously sort of looked at in detail? I know obviously you mentioned the sort of transport for gravels as well. Just wondering if you could add anything on that, if possible.
It's very different depending on the river and how energetic it is and how much sediment moves. The sort of the approach that we have at the moment is where possible, you let the river do the work. So unless you've got a particular constraint within the floodplain that means the river can't move, the idea is that you sort of give it a nudge and then let nature take activities forward. So the river rib, the first one case I presented, there wasn't much change until we'd had a particular peak flood flow that went through and actually started shifting and moving the gravel around in that scheme, and that had a particular response. And it's not so much nowadays that we're looking to get to a fixed state, but something that will move and is dynamic over time. Don't know if that helps.
No, that definitely does. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Ed. We've got a question. Oh, sorry, that's just asking whether this presentation is going to be made available afterwards. Yes, it is. It usually takes about a week for presentations to be made available online, and you can see them under the Discover and Learn tab on the FBA website. We have a question from Leonard. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, Leonard?
Oh, Judy, very interesting talk. I was wondering, in terms of target, how has your notion of, I mean, you had this historical walkthrough of your career, what you've been doing. How has your notion of targets in terms of restoration? Has that changed over time, or is it the same?
It's definitely changed over time. Initially, when we started, I hope you can't hear my phone in the background. When we were sort of the early days, we'd have a particular species or a particular habitat in mind, and that would be sort of like whether we'd achieved it or not. If it was something simple like taking a weir out to improve fish passage, then we'd tag the fish and see if they moved, and yes, we know it worked. But nowadays, that's one of the things that is trying to get our heads around, is what we are trying to achieve, and it will be different for individual schemes, which but it's more about whether the ecosystem is working, whether the processes are working. But inevitably, in any monitoring, we need the controls. So the controls can either be a good control or a bad modified channel control. So you've got something to compare the baseline against. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot.
I had a question, Judy, if you'll indulge me. Your study where you looked at the, I think it was Betis, the mayfly abundance when you were introducing the gravel.
Yeah.
Do you know if you displaced other species, or whether you kind of increased abundance of one and something else got pushed out because the habitat wasn't suitable for them?
Yeah, in that case, we went from a deep silty channel. So our baseline survey was basically chironomids and oligochaetes and a few hog lice and things. So yes, some of them did get displaced, but we left some at silty areas for them, so they did get changed.
Great.
The earlier question is, when somebody was asked about presentation, if they want any of the information before it becomes available, do just email me and I can pass it on.
That's great. Thank you, Judy. We've got a question here from Naomi, whose microphone's not working. But she asks, how do you find working with general public and landowners? Is there much resistance to restoration work? And if so, how do you manage this?
I fortunately don't have to do too much of that, and I have other colleagues who do those things. But it has changed over the years. In the early days, some of the landowners would just look at you a bit odd if you wanted to go and do something to the river and didn't quite understand what we're doing. But there's now just much more acceptance that restoration is a good thing and they can see the benefits of it. So the early days, we would take reluctant landowners to look at particular sections of the river that had already been restored, so they'd understand what was going on. One of the key things that's usually a bit of a shock is just post-restoration. You might have a very bare channel. It just looks a bit like a quagmire of just mud. So getting people to understand that that's part of the process, then that just be patient. It will get better over time. That's been really useful. Also, in the early days, it was like the Environment Agency, well, you want to do something to the river, are you going to pay me for it? Whereas people now are much more accepting and interested in that, but also the people like the Rivers Trusts and the local interest groups, it's sort of peers talking to peers rather than us suggesting a good thing as a sort of remote organisation. There is a sort of a swell of people who actually want to do this work.
Great, thank you. Veronica, did you want to ask a question about multimorph updates.
Just a quick one, Judy, is we've been using it with our students, as you know, for the last couple of years because our local restoration projects are not being monitored. And the students had real problems with the form and then when you've got the scoring system because they don't match up. Are you looking to update and make that easier? Because if our undergraduates are having problems, I'm sure citizen scientists
I
would
think
also.
I would have to refer to Angela and Lucy for that one.
Okay.
But I can get back to you on about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Sean, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Judy your question?
Yeah, thank you, Louise. I hope my question is relevant. I am a farmer, but I just wonder if there's any data to show that rates of water infiltration into the soil is impacting a catchment scale on those rivers, and you might see, in terms of nutrient transport, water purification, and so forth. Thank you, Judy.
Also, not off the top of my head, I haven't, but I can ask around. I don't know if anybody in the audience is able to answer that question.
Judy, are you okay with me sharing your detail? How should people get in touch with you if they have further questions? Would you like them to email me and then I can forward stuff to you?
That's probably easiest in the short term. Yeah.
Sure, I'll put my my email address in the chat. That's fine. Mark Gessner says he doesn't have a question, but he's very pleased to hear that major geomorphological dynamics are allowed in UK restoration schemes. I'm guessing maybe it's different in Germany. Claire, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Judy your question?
Hi there. Yeah, I was just wondering, as you were talking about morph, I was just thinking about monitoring of SSSI rivers, or not necessarily where weirs have been removed, but where they're not in good condition already, and whether anyone is already using a morph survey to expand capacity for monitoring using citizen science.
I'm not sure off the top of my head where it has been used. I know it's been used quite a bit in the New Forest in some of their work. There's an over in Gloucestershire in the Forest of Dean. They've been using it to look at natural flood management. So what we're hoping that as more and more sorts of coordinated schemes go ahead, we'll actually be able to present the results so that people will actually see not only sort of what the surveys will tell you, but also you'll be able to see how the people have applied the survey in terms of the sort of backy approach type thing.
Presumably it would be appropriate in that
Yep,
kind of
definitely. I suggest heading to just type Modular River Survey in Google, and that'll take you to the website. You'll be able to look at the maps and see what work's been going on.
Thank you.
Jennifer has a question. Jennifer, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Judy your question?
Hi, Judy.
Hello.
Thanks for the talk. I just have a question about monitoring, of course. And we have this issue with the kind of ideal that we want to do for monitoring to gather the evidence against, as you mentioned frequently, the funds available to actually achieve that. Do you have any ideas about how to try and make more funds available or try to get around that problem we have?
What we're hoping is to have some sort of special sort of scientific funding. I know there's a LIFE project, European LIFE project that we're able to contribute to. So we're hoping to link up with a few universities and get some more sort of bespoke sort of monitoring and lessons learned to help address some of these. With my personal hat on, I've got a few schemes that sort of kind of pop out that we've done some, albeit kick sampling, but sort of long-term changes. But I know as from your work, you'll know that different approaches will tell you different things, and survey samples will tell you a lot more than a kick sample, but only if you've done enough of them.
Thanks.
Thank you. I just noticed Chris Spray has replied to Sean's question about water purification and infiltration rates and that kind of thing. So maybe if you have further questions on that, Sean, Chris might be your man to talk to.
Well, thanks, Chris.
Are there any more questions for Judy? I think we're getting to the end of the questions now, but I thought that was an excellent talk, and really interesting to hear of the kind of the historic way in which river restoration was done, and the way in which it's progressing now. So that was fascinating. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
So I am going to call that a wrap on Judy's presentation and seminar today. So all that's left to say is, again, big thank you and a round of applause, if you can find the round of applause button for Judy. And join us next time on the 9th of June, where our next seminar will be delivered by Dr. Michelle Jackson on global change in aquatic ecosystems from Africa to the Arctic. If you haven't registered for that already, I will very quickly pop a link to that in the chat box, where you can find out more information and register if you would like to. But thanks again, Judy.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you for listening.